Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. You can always watch us on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and on our own website, Muslim Network TV. And we are, of course, on YouTube and Facebook as well. And pretty soon we'll be on Apple TV as well. Um, Today, we are saying that is in the beginning of pandemic, that world has changed. It will never be the same. And right now, as the current Black liberation movement is rising, and reportedly, which has sent President Trump into a White House bunker, it is same thing being said. The world has changed. I remember hearing the same thing after 9/11. Everyone was saying world will never be the same. But as America and Taliban are sitting on the peace table trying to end the longest lasting American war, as there is freedom struggle in the Muslim world, which most recently liberated Sudan, it turned towards the democracy. And in the case of Syria, where peaceful protesters were bombed and tortured while they were asking peacefully for a right to vote. I wonder how Americans have been learning about Islam and Muslim, because we continue to come in the news. Are we learning better? How 9/11 changed the way America studies Islam at its universities and academic institutions? Has their interest about Islam and Muslim increased, or has it decreased? Are these studies which are being done are improving in some aspects, are going bad in other aspects? Are we still debating about good Muslims or bad Muslims, or Salafi Muslims or the Sufi Muslims? And to discuss this with us is no other than a director of Islamic World Studies program and a professor of theology department at Loyola University, Marcia Hermanson. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Wa alaikum assalam, Mujahid sir. Nice to be here.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. She teaches courses in Islamic studies and the academic study of religion. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago in Arabic and Islamic Studies. Dr. Hermanson has been contributing numerous academic articles in the field of Islamic thought, Sufism, Islam, and Muslims in South Asia, Muslims in America, and women in Islam. How are you doing today?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing fine. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your essays and different writings about Islamic studies and things like that in America. I was just, while preparing, I was just taken to a different world, which I left behind, the world of academics, and reading and enjoying. And I said, oh my God, I need to take note from this. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So you talk about the people they used to say 9/11 change everything, and I saw that was title of one of your program. How did it change Islamic studies at the universities?
Okay, I think I might like to both use your framework and maybe complicate it a bit. So I think you're
absolutely they complicate things.
Well, because it's not, I mean, I don't really agree that, 9/11 changed Islamic studies. But I do agree that political events and interests can shape what is studied. And I think we have to understand that patronage, what gets funded, what gets supported, so there's always in understanding a phenomenon, the sort of idea side of the explanation, and then there's the material side of the explanation. So, material funding and resources and what gets funded. So on the one hand, you could say, oh, after 9/11, all this money went into security studies and anti-terrorism studies or something like that. But at the end of the day, that probably did not influence the field of academic Islamic studies, right? It may have, of course, Islamic studies, knowing something about Muslims and Islamic thought might be studied by those people with a kind of political surveillance interest, but it probably didn't shape the core field. Whereas certain other developments probably had a lot more shaping. So let's back up a little bit. 9/11 is kind of, for you and I, recent memory, maybe not so much for the college students who were just born at that time, but really the Cold War. So I would say the shaping of the study of the languages of others, the cultures of others, and by extension, or getting specific, Islam, the Middle East, South Asia, and so on, that really emerges in the Cold War dynamic. Like, we have to understand, we have to win hearts and minds. So I think you can see right away that there's a tension between the sort of soft, we need to understand peace, and the harder, and if we understand, we can achieve our goals, peace. And of course, that's always the way it is. And you see that echoed again after 9/11. But I think maybe even less of, we have to understand and win hearts and minds. Like, that piece drops down. But if I can add just one thing, I think the demographic, so if we're talking about the United States, Islamic studies in the United States, now the fact that most of the graduate students in Islamic studies are Muslim and are the children of South Asian and Arab Muslim immigrants to the United States who came here in the 1980s, that probably has much more impact than a political event. And we'll probably come back to that.
Okay, so you're saying that things which we started at the Cold War era, which is wow, when was it? And studying the languages and culture to win over the mind. So when the Cold War was over, did that phenomena went down?
Yeah, well, of course, the Cold War, so you could say, so you have two things happening, if you remember back. So like in the 1990s, right, you have the collapse of the Soviet Union. But then, so it's like, okay, we no longer have, ideally, okay, I'm speaking ideally. So we don't need to know about the Middle East and Africa and India to better have our proxy, conflicts fought out there. But the fact that the Soviet Union collapses, you have, at least for a time, the idea of Islam as the new enemy, right? You always need a new enemy, right? Green power. Well, who was it? Dan Quayle, right? Who made some kind of famous statement, that the new force is the green peril or something like that. So again, that on the one hand, you might say, so okay, there might be more interest in learning about Islam as the new threat, to American hegemony. And maybe you can even build 9/11 onto that, because it's really only, it's within a decade, right, of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in that decade, it's like know thy enemy kind of thing, just like Russian studies might have been big in the Cold War, but Russian studies and Soviet studies now, it's not that much funding, patronage, interest, career paths. But I think if we keep running that trajectory, what you see in the Trump era is maybe the biggest decline. You see a big decline in funding for the humanities, because basically the right does not want, the new generation to have kind of high level critical analysis, humanity, so it's just like, let's just have practical job training. So you have defunding generally. And then within that defunding, you have American isolationism, right? So you don't really need to, they should just know our languages and we dominate the world and we're the top, and what and the sort of, many of the young people who study foreign languages might be thinking of State Department careers or international activities. Those fields are also contracting, right? Because America is not that interested in the rest of the world. So there's also that, that kind of thread. So again, it's sort of, how do you understand what Islamic studies is? Some of it is languages, some of it is culture of Muslim societies, but some of it is what have Muslims thought and what are Muslims thinking today. So each of those areas is kind of on a different trajectory, right? Because there's a difference between area studies. Like in the Cold War, it was mainly area studies. You learn about the language and the culture, and then you know about that area of the world. But that actually, there are very few places now where you can do area studies.
So so you're saying one of the major variable which is impacting this area are Muslim studying at the university, and they're giving a shape of it. So uh, uh, share a little more about it. Why Muslims are studying Islam in the universities and how it is shaping.
Okay, great. And that's a great segue from the point I was making before, that if we say Islamic studies, there are different compartments. Are we talking about area studies and languages and culture? But if we talk about actually Islamic studies normally refers to understanding the Islamic intellectual and religious tradition. And of course, you have to know about language and culture in order to do that. So in that particular area, what has shifted since the 1970s and so on. So back in the day, the students in those we're talking about graduate program now, but we can also talk about undergraduate. Because if you don't have undergraduate interest in a subject, it's very hard to justify training experts in that subject. I mean, yes, you will need some experts, but there should also be the undergraduate interest in a field. But in any case, demographically, so 50 years ago, it was only Euro Americans who were studying, for PhDs, studying Islamic studies, and only the very rare. So you had these Muslim intellectuals like Said Hussein Nasser, Fazl Rahman, Ismail Faruqi. They were the rare exceptions of those who came from the Muslim world and achieved high recognition, high profile in the field. But their students were mainly Americans, right? But now if you go to any top graduate program, you'll find that most of the students are Muslim. Now, some decry that and say, like, there goes the neighborhood. You're no longer going to have objective, real academic study of Islam because you have all these people with, so to speak, a dog in the fight, an axe to grind, the believers, right? So there's this other field that we should talk about, religion, and how religion is studied at the university. And if
So,
you like to, maybe I'll give you a break to steer the conversation.
so are there, say, 50% Muslims who are studying Islam and 50% others, or it is overwhelming Muslims studying Islam?
So we're talking at the graduate level, right? MA and PhD students in the United States. I haven't seen a demographic, analysis, so I can only tell you, intuitively or anecdotally. Anecdotally, I definitely think the majority are Muslim background who are studying Islam from the religious aspect. Now, by the way, you have another thing going on today, which I alluded to, but let me say it again more explicitly. There has been a kind of defunding of the humanities. So many of the top graduate schools, like University of Chicago or University of Michigan, they may only be allowed to admit one student a year or 3 students a year. So because those students, when they graduate, will not be able to get jobs because there are so few jobs. So you have what I'm trying to make the point that there are a number of kind of variables going on beyond the intrinsic interest of a subject, beyond the demand for it, and so on. There are sort of broader forces that are impacting, but there is a tremendous interest. And by the way, that's not just for Islamic studies. Take Hindu studies, So people who are studying Hinduism in graduate school in America are usually South Asian, Hindus of South Asian background. Not all, but
You're watching Muslim Network TV. This is Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Professor Marcia Hermanson, and Muslim Talk, Muslim Network is always available on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, as well as MuslimNetwork.tv. We'll be right back after these messages.
Assalamualaikum!
I love Adam's World because it makes me learn in a fun way. That Adam has a green face and orange hair. I like this song. I like how Adam sings. I like Adam's World because it makes me happy. What? No. 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 And here's Adam and here's Anissa. Adam and his sister. Adam is a boy and he is really smart.
Download the new Adam's World app at adamsworldapp.com and let's help tomorrow's Muslims today.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Malik Mujahid, and we are talking with Marcia Hermanson. So you talked about who is studying Islam right now. Tell me, who is teaching Islam?
Well, on the whole, I think I used in my class an article, a kind of introductory article, a reflection by an American Muslim professor written in the 1990s, where he laments that there are only a handful of Muslims teaching Islamic studies at American universities. And my students read that and they think that that's the current situation. It's like, oh, that's really bad. But in fact, the game has changed completely since the 1990s. So you had mentioned early in the show 9/11. So after 9/11, and for quite a few years after, is the study of Islam became the hottest field in the study of religion. So the largest professional organization is called American Academy of Religion. And they keep a tally of how many jobs open every year, Hindu studies, Judaic studies, and so on. And Islamic studies was disproportionately high for about a decade after 9/11. And quite a few of the people graduating at that time were of Muslim background, or were Americans, European Americans who had accepted, African Americans who had accepted Islam. So many of those teaching Islam in America today are Muslim. Yes, quite a few. I don't know, I can't tell you the percentage, but just visually, if you go to the American Academy of Religion, probably the majority are of Muslim background, the younger scholars.
Okay, so 9/11 then has substantial contribution on both sides, who is teaching it and who is studying it.
Well, who's studying it, I think, was not about 9/11. It was just a very natural thing that a Muslim growing up in America who was intellectually inclined and wanted to study his or her tradition, could make that kind of serious commitment to do graduate study.
Tell me, do Islamophobes object to what is being taught at the universities? They go around objecting to almost everything. Have they targeted professors who are teaching Islam at the universities?
Definitely. It of course depends. I'll give you one example, or maybe a couple of examples. So the very fact that Islam is taught at all, I mean, if you're an Islamophobe, you don't want it taught at all. Better deny that it exists, that strategy. So when Islamic World Studies at Loyola began in 2006, so if you're like doing a web search, you'll find that the Islamophobic website Campus Watch kind of excerpted, some bland notice saying Loyola University Chicago opened an Islamic World Studies program. And then it's put up on Campus Watch as if this is scary, as people are studying about the Muslim world. That, silence it, don't say it. So there's sort of that level. Then the content of what is actually taught. So the very fact that you teach about Islam, you might end up on a watch list. In fact, by the way, I'm on the professor watch list, which was established by a conservative activist group of students, probably in league with certain of these other organizations after Trump's election. So I mean, the very the very fact that you exist. Now, of course, those professors, and by the way, a lot of the professors on the watch list, I'm in very good company. So in general, you get on the watch list if you teach about race. So not just Islam, but race. Or of course, Middle East politics. So for a long time, the driver, and to some extent still the driver of organized Islamophobia, is a particular agenda in Middle Eastern politics, right? So if you venture, so somebody like Rashid Khalidi, who does Palestinian studies, is of course on the watch list. But even by extension, anything about Islam, becomes undesirable. Can I put it that way?
Have some universities backed out or asked their faculty, give them some guideline to be careful and this and that?
I'm trying to, oh yes, well see the problem, thank you, you reminded me, because implicit in your question, and probably you're aware of it, was there was some issue around the University of North Carolina that had received funding to do various kinds of, that we talked about patronage before. So for very high level universities that have diversified offerings in area studies, language, history, a bunch of professors, a PhD program, they may become Title VI centers that are supported by government grants to promote and effectively engage in the teaching about these cultures, and also they do public information kind of events. So University of North Carolina had certain events and certain courses. I think one was like Iranian cinema. So in general, probably what most intelligent humanistic people would think were important and reasonable courses to offer about what goes on in Muslim societies. But some of their I hope I'm explaining this properly. If some of their public forum events got into discussing the Israeli-Palestinian question, and some of the remarks made there had caught the interest of individuals in the American government who disliked that kind of political stance, and then they tried to remove the funding. And then, of course, the universities become very nervous about surveillance and so on. So you have within American political lobbies, you know, the universities do try to be cautious because so there's a tension, right, between freedom of speech. So here it's playing out in terms of what might be our interest in having a diversity of perspectives taught about Islam. But they also play out, of course, in left-right issues and race issues. And so there's always the tension between complete academic freedom and a sense that powerful individuals may not like certain opinions to be voiced publicly within the context of a university.
Considering that, according to your research, 90% of the news in the mainstream media about Muslims is negative, do you think those type of questions pop up in the classrooms?
Yeah, I'm not really sure about that statistic that 90% of the news about Muslims is negative. I guess it depends, you know, if you're talking about Fox News or if you, again, so we have a lot of.
No. This is Washington Post, New York Times, not Fox. This is a very authentic research of more than 38,000 news items, comparing Muslim coverage, comparing Jewish coverage, and comparing coverage of the African American community. And
Yeah.
they found there were.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'd really have to look at the research and how it was defined. I actually, again, I don't find that very credible because
Okay, I'm not more on that. My
know,
point is not regarding the authenticity of research. My point is, do questions about what goes on in media pop up in the classrooms?
Oh, you mean do questions about how Muslims are portrayed in media? So it's a very good question.
Trade or current issues or current discussions?
Yeah. Again, I'm sorry, but when a question is very complex, I feel like we need to frame it. So there's a vast difference between where your students live and are studying in the United States. So we in Chicago live in a very diverse and generally quite liberal area. So the students come in kind of prepared to be skeptical about Islamophobic and stereotypical material. They recognize that it's out there. They've seen it. They may remember in their early papers and reflections encountering, of course, if they're Muslim, they may have directly encountered, you know, anti-Muslim rhetoric and so on. But even other students may have witnessed or heard, or their friends. So people are aware of it, and often they're very critical. I know from colleagues that in other parts of the country that are less diverse, you might have a different task as an instructor, because you would have to begin by, and some professors do, begin almost with a unit on media studies, which I'm sure, you know, you're interested in those kinds of things. So, you know, how does the media work? How are stereotypes promulgated? How are stories framed? Who chooses what gets published? So you first have to do that kind of work, and then you can try to make the students more critical about what they've always consumed because they've never heard the other side. So there are different contexts, but yes, definitely there has to be early on a discussion of Islamophobia, stereotyping, and so on. You know, and where you have to educate the students may vary from one context to another. And how diverse the classroom is Some classrooms are dominated by Muslims. Some classrooms, the students have never met a Muslim.
Okay, so your program is called Islamic World Studies. So how is it different from the Islamic studies?
Great question. And I have to confess that I borrowed the Islamic World Studies idea from Dr. Amina McLeod at DePaul University, who founded a program with the same name. And this is very strategic. This is strategic in various ways. Part of it is just pragmatic. If you teach Middle East studies, let's say at a place like Loyola or DePaul, you may only have a handful of professors who are experts in that part of the world. So it's very difficult to create a program because you can't offer enough courses. Okay. Also, of course, Middle East studies is very politically charged. It's actually even more charged than Islamic studies or Islamic world studies. Islamic studies, if you have Islamic studies, the expectation is that you will be teaching only or almost exclusively about the religion of Islam, more theological, the practices of Muslims and so on. So it's rather narrow, especially for a program that is largely offered to undergraduates. Islamic world studies has an upside and a downside. The upside is that you can include courses on the Balkans, Africa, India and Pakistan, Muslims in America, African American Islam, but also, about non-Muslims in various cultures where Muslim civilization has had an influence. So you can recruit a much broader swath of faculty. And also it doesn't have to be about religion. So somebody could take a course about Bollywood cinema, and if some of those movies have significant content about Muslims, it could be taught in an Islamic World Studies program. So that's the upside. The downside, which some of my colleagues who are not in the program raised when we tried to initiate the program, is what is the Islamic world? And there's sort of a liberal and a conservative critique there. So the conservative critique was like, we don't talk about Christian world studies or Christendom studies. So how can you talk about Islamic world studies? Like, the term is specious. But you also have a critique. There was a recent book written by a scholar, John Dogley, where he says this whole Muslim world is in fact a sort of colonial construct. If you talk about the Muslim world, it's almost like the Huntington thesis. It conveys the idea that Muslims function as a civilizational bloc. So there's actually even a political downside to it. So, it's like there's no perfect solution. I'm not saying Islamic world studies is everyone should do that. It's the perfect solution. It's working for us now, but it does have some tensions in the name.
Thank you. This is Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Professor Marcia Hermanson, and you're watching Muslim Network TV. We're on Galaxy 19 as well as Amazon Fire TV and many other places. We'll be right back after these messages.
We are Justice for All. Headquartered in the heart of downtown Chicago, Justice for All is a global humanitarian initiative dedicated to raising awareness for human rights concerns impacting vulnerable minority groups. We promote policies that protect religious freedom, address the root causes of mass displacement, and recognize the plight of refugees and forced migrants. Our diverse team of staff and volunteers, led by Imam Malik Mujahid, work tirelessly to help Justice for All achieve their goals. Past campaigns covered a wide range of humanitarian concerns. Through Bosnia Task Force, imams and leaders of Chicago's Muslim community worked to ensure Bosnia became a top national issue. This led to life-saving American policies in Bosnia. A key accomplishment was helping to get rape declared a war crime. Initiatives also included Kosovo Task Force, Central African Republic Task Force, and Flint Coalition, which brought awareness to the water crisis affecting the people of Flint, Michigan. Highlights of our work include supporting Black Lives Matter, Parliament of the World's Religions, addressing climate change.
So wasteful consumption starts the ruthless production, and that's where we need all the fossil fuel in the world.
And prominent media exposure.
This is Imam Malik Mujahid, President of Justice for All.
And I'm the Director of Outreach for Justice for All.
And that's why we need to go back to what worked.
Today we're demanding an apology from the CEO of Costco.
The Chinese crackdown on Uyghurs and other Turkic people has only gotten worse.
Current programs such as Burma Task Force advocate for the rights of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, internally displaced populations, and all those denied freedom of movement and at risk of starvation. Through this, we mobilized thousands of calls to elected representatives. This paved the way for the U.S. to increase funding for Rohingya refugees from $30 million to $210 million. Two of our documentaries were featured on international news outlets. The Rohingya People, A Slow-Burning Genocide on BBC World News, and Rohingya Refugees Tel Aviv Massacre was featured on CNN. We've organized rallies, UN mission visits, expanded presentations on campuses, promoted research and report writing, outreach to think tanks, media, and other influencers. Faith Coalition educates about the Rohingya genocide and crimes against humanity faced by ethnic groups in Burma. We've traveled to refugee camps, convened a meeting of Karen, Kachin, and Rohingya leaders, both to encourage cooperation and to guide them in congressional outreach. We organized Rohingya Advocacy Day. This led to over 100 participants visiting the offices of 60 U.S. senators and congressional representatives. Free Kashmir advocates for the people of Kashmir. Long-term goals include the call for self-determination, the end of the Indian military's occupation of the territory, and raising awareness of Kashmiri issues among the American people. After the August 5th reinvasion of Kashmir, we organized national protests in front of various Indian government buildings, partnered with Stand With Kashmir, and launched a petition condemning the Gates Foundation's decision to present Prime Minister Modi a humanitarian award. Save Uyghur informs Muslims and neighbors of other faiths about the ongoing cultural genocide of Uyghur Muslims and mobilizes public support. Our projects include boycotting Chinese products with our Fast from China campaign, pushing Bill S0178 in the Senate, and organizing a nationwide protest of Costco. Together, we can continue to stand up for justice. Justice for all.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Professor Marcia Hermansen about the state of Islamic studies in America. Marcia, how contemporary are these courses? Does the freedom struggle in the Muslim world, like Arab Springs, also get to be discussed?
Well, definitely no. Of course, when you say these courses, you know, it's like who, where, when. So in Islamic World Studies at Loyola, for example, there have been entire courses offered on the Arab Spring. They've been offered in the political science department by political scientists. But so Islamic World Studies, you know, as you might imagine, has a lot of scope for contemporary studies.
Okay. So, do you have any idea if same is the situation, say, at the University of Chicago and other campuses around Chicago land?
Well, I don't think there's any issue. You know, it's funny that you would ask that. What comes into my mind, I believe in the American context, courses tend in programs. You know, if there's only one person at a university who's teaching the subject and they don't have any social science or contemporary background, then that university program may not have much contemporary content. But if you're talking about major research universities, probably they have a lot of contemporary. And I have a feeling that in America, you know, contemporary is almost the opposite. You know, people will say, well, you don't have enough classical. Now, I have looked at some Middle Eastern programs in terms of evaluating, you know, graduate programs, let's say in Arab countries. And on the one hand, you might not expect this, but if you think about it, I think you can realize why. They would tend to stay away from very contemporary topics because it's too controversial. You're not going to talk about the Arab Spring in an Egyptian university. Do you see what that'd be a kind of censorship, you know, to stay away from? But you also may not have enough emphasis on the medieval or the classical, you know, in abroad. You know, so there's always this balance. How much do you need to know about the past in order to have a rigorous understanding of the past?
In one of your essays, you assert that Sufi movements have a impact in America on Muslim community as well as on American culture, which is significant and increasing. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not exactly sure which context you're referring to, but if I may try to shape your question the way I want to shape it. So one of my subfields is Islamic mysticism or Sufism. And then I created this little niche within it, which was Sufism in the West and contemporary American Sufi movements. And I have a bunch of articles about that. And I think if I can talk about the field of Islamic studies, that in the latter part of the 20th century, a lot of Islamic studies was done in religious studies departments. Remember, we said area studies is pretty small. Very few universities in the West had Islamic studies programs. So you would have a department of religion or religious studies, and they would have one person who taught Islam, one person might teach Hinduism, one person might teach Judaism, and so on. And usually, and we're going back now, right, to the 1970s, 80s, maybe even 90s, that one person, usually when they were hiring, the people doing the hiring, of course, they weren't experts in Islamic studies, but they had a feeling that the person had better know Arabic, because you can't do Islamic studies without knowing Arabic. And then the other thing was they liked to have somebody who studied mysticism and Sufism, because the undergraduate students were interested, you know, and also religion and experience and the kind of things that people who study religion, especially in a sort of pluralistic, like what is religion in human experience? Sufism was very appealing. So Sufism was quite a dominant, you know, academic interest back then. So one of the things that has shifted in more recent decades, and again, you almost have contradictory developments. It is no longer essential to know Arabic to do research and to get a position in Islamic studies in the West. If you're an expert in, you know, a Persianate society or Indonesia, it's great if you know Arabic. Maybe you've had a couple of years, but it's not essential anymore. And that's this shift away from text to lived Islam, what we might say the anthropologization. You know, it was, one used to say, there is no Islam there are only Islams, the individual, the cultural, the particular. And of course, many Muslims find that rather objectionable. Fazl Rahman said first they're going to say there's no Islam, there are only Islams, and ultimately there is no Islam. It's just a free-for-all. That's another tension within the field. But sorry, we were talking about Sufism. So also nowadays, Sufism is no longer the thing that is being hired for. People like, Islam in hip hop, or Islam in, some more cultural study, or American Islam, or female Quran reciters in Indonesia. So the field is much broader than it used to be, because remember, the undergraduate students today are not the students of the 70s and 80s. It's no longer the generation of seekers. It's a different cohort.
After 9/11, there was a debate about a good Muslim and a bad Muslim. And suddenly I started reading Sufi Muslims are good Muslims. So how that discourse reflected in the study of Islam in America?
Okay, I'll try to explain my take on your question. Well, of course, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim was the title of a book written by Mamdani. So it was not, often when I speak overseas, in fact, it became controversial. I gave a talk in Karachi and I mentioned the theory of good Muslim, bad Muslim. So the theory of good Muslim, bad Muslim, according to Mamdani, is that governments, right-wing think tanks, Western powers want to impose their definition of good Islam and bad Islam. Good Islam is Islam that is friendly to the West, that is docile, that is not politicized or violent. And bad Islam is, terrorism, violence, conservatism, anti-woman, that. So it was always an outsiders, a critical definition by outsiders that was describing a phenomenon. I mean, sorry, I'm not saying Mamdani was an outsider, but he was pointing at this fact that outsiders were trying to define for Muslims. And then that led, again, we're back to patronage. So you had, Muslim governments start having Sufi music festivals, and they start, having a culture-friendly Islam as opposed to a rigid Saudi-esque, rule-based articulation of the faith, right? So that's what it's about. So that's the nice thing about doing academic Islamic studies, is that you step back and you think about, where is this coming from? Why is this, who benefits? Who's getting the patronage? So you can be a bit critical and cynical about these definitions, where it's a more, sort of naive perception that, there are good Muslims out there and we should support them. And then Muslims like, I'm one of them, support me, kind of thing. And then, of course, you become tainted in the eyes of your fellow Muslims because you have accepted this patronage. So that was, for Sufis, kind of a dilemma, like, do we want to say, yes, we're the good Muslims and support us? Because then, of course, you're kind of implying, and there are those bad guys, So again, you're allowing outsiders to define what you are.
Tell us that one of your article, you referred to emergence of Muslim public intellectuals in America. What do you mean by that? Give us some example, and how influential are they?
Oh, that's very interesting, and that's a more recent work, and that's also related to some of the work I'm doing right now. I'm going to be presenting on American Muslims in a time of coronavirus. So those of us, when you do Islamic studies, yes, you study texts and you study languages, but you also, I know you're a political scientist, so the social sciences often allow you to step back and, again, do some critical analysis. So Muslims in America, of course, here the state does not have that much, I mean, the government does not have that much overt control over who speaks for Islam. So usually in that space, you no longer have like groups from abroad deciding what American Muslims, should do or might do. But then you have Islamic organizations. But on the whole, aside from a relatively narrow band of generally older people, the Islamic organizations are also not the thought leaders. So you have the emergence of Muslim public intellectuals. Some of them come from the universities, and some of them are like media preachers, and some of them try to bridge. So you could analyze each figure. I'm speaking of figures like Hamza Yusuf Hansen or Yasser Qadhi or so on, who have their own following. And by the way, I'm not saying that they are isolated or antithetical to Muslim organizations. They kind of reinforce one another, right? So the Islamic organization would love to have one of these figures on their program or their fiqh council, or bolstering what you might call the charismatic authority of the organization, rather than simply, routine authority or knowledge about fiqh. So the public intellectuals, that Muslim or a certain segment of Muslims, usually younger Muslims, by younger, I mean, maybe under 40 or under 30 in particular, would go to these individuals for guidance and authority, rather than some kind of broader structure.
So do you see that phenomena increasing or decreasing?
Well, the theory that the sort of sociologists who are looking at that phenomena in this time of coronavirus tend to argue that it's actually increasing because Muslims have more choice in who they're going to listen to on a regular basis, not just webinars or Celebrate Mercy or whatever, but even in terms of khutbahs. Since you can't go to your local mosque, if you want to hear a khutbah or a sermon, you can go anywhere. So you can vote with your browser, instead of kind of being stuck with what your local authority offers. So the hypothesis is that it would actually increase the authority of the public intellectuals, that more people would choose to listen to their talks and khutbahs, because it's no longer attached to a particular ritual space, i.e. the Juma prayer.
So in your studies about Sufism, one of the things which you say is it has an impact on American culture. I'd like to hear a little more about how Sufism in America has an impact on public space.
That's a great question, and I should probably do more of an update on that, because I think that was certainly, I'm imagining that those pieces were written in the 90s and even post, first decade post 9/11. So I think you had two things going on. One, I've already alluded to, the sort of when America was in the phase of spiritual seeking, like the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, Sufism was like a flavor of religiosity, like yoga or Zen meditation. So Sufism was the Islamic version that anyone could sort of dip into and find it friendly and somewhat transformative. And that has been a characteristic of religion in America, that Americans expect their religion to do something for them, to make them healthier, to make them, in some cases, is what's called, you may have heard it, the prosperity gospel, to make them do better in some way. So in a way, Sufism fulfilled that and was sort of a bridge, right? And then you had, of course, the Rumi translations and, public figures who dabbled in Sufism and so on. Post 9/11, there was briefly that sort of trying to be the space of the good Muslims, Imam Faisal Rauf and the up to the what was that called? Sorry, it's pejorative. Later people, anti-Muslims, called it the ground zero mosque, right? The idea of building a cosmopolitan, welcoming, Sufi-inflected, Muslim space in New York City. So, I mean, those would be just a few examples, right, of Sufi-influenced Muslims who might not use the name Sufi, but still, I mean, to a certain extent, you could even say something like the Hamza Yusuf and Zaytuna, the sort of adab movement among younger Muslims. It was like a bridge. We're no longer going to be like this political Hizb ut-Tahrir thing. We're going to be this adab, knowing our tradition. So that's not as directly into American culture as my two previous examples, but it's a way that American Islam was able to make peace with Sufism. In the 80s, it was like Sufism bid'ah. It was like the Jamaat and the MB, Sufism, that's bad stuff, stay away from it. And gradually, it's not Sufism, it's not that weird, popular culture stuff. It's ihsan, it's being a good person, it's, having nice adab, but it's very based, in authentic. So that's kind of among them. So you have a kind of rehabilitation where Sufism becomes more Islamicized in the West and more relevant to Muslims, but maybe less relevant to American culture and having less of a broader impact.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Marcia Hermanson. She's a professor and the director of Islamic World Studies program at Loyola University in Chicago. You're watching Muslim Network TV. We're on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, and Roku, and on our own website, MuslimNetwork.tv. Thank you so much for watching. Salam. Peace.